Tonight's speaker is Charles Van Rees, who is a postdoctoral research scientist at the Flathead Biological Station. And he's been there for a little while, but he is leaving soon in, July, and heading to Georgia, where he's going to be a research scientist at the Odum School of Ecology and River Basin Center at the University of Georgia, which is a really prestigious place. Of course, Eugene Odum, that's where the name came from, very famous ecologist. So he'll be leaving Montana for a while, but hopefully we'll see him again in the future. Who knows, right? Well, tonight he's going to talk to us about some research insights and outdoor experiences from a Fulbright year in Europe's birding Mecca. And if you haven't read your affiliated post, you'll know that Mecca is Spain. So, Charles, I think the program is yours.
All right. Would it be possible to enable screen sharing so I can throw the slides up? I always forget how to do that, but I think that's a host thing.
I think we're still getting some background noise. I don't know if it's you, Charles, or someone else. So just check your mics.
Yeah, if everyone can check and hit their mute button.
Corey, are you going to enable screen share?
It's my, I don't know.
Yours?
I'm trying to figure out exactly where to go. I can do make host.
Yeah, you can do that too, and that probably works.
I'll just give you power.
I'm very trustworthy.
Does anybody know if the internet ever got restored in the Flathead? Nobody knows.
Amy Seaman is the host now.
Okay, here we go.
One of the two Amy's.
One of the two Amy's.
All right, try it now, Charles.
Okay, got it. All right. Can everybody see a little cover slide here? Perfect. Then I'll get started. Yeah, thanks very much, everybody, for tuning in, and of course, the Audubon Society again for having me back. So I already got this wonderful introduction from Dave, so I'll get straight into, I guess, a few more details on myself and kind of where I'm coming from. In my experience, and people certainly say that you can learn a lot more about somebody from the company they keep. So I always like to start with a slide that my sort of what I call my NASCAR slide that has all the various logos of places that I've worked with and been affiliated with in the past. So like I said, I came up here originally to work at the Flathead Lake Biostation. I was there for about 18 months, and now I'm moving on to a new position down in Georgia at the Odum School of Ecology. And I worked in Montana before, actually out of Bozeman, working for the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, which is a wonderful nonprofit outfit down there. I had a great time working with them. And then did my PhD at Tufts University between their biology and their water diplomacy programs. So my expertise is primarily around conservation biology, and I'm an applied ecologist. So I do research primarily on how to prevent species extinctions and environmental impacts from human society. And my focus has primarily been on freshwater biodiversity, which is one of the most threatened realms of biodiversity in the world. And one major interest of mine, zooming in from there, is how human societies interact with ecosystems in our management of fresh water. Most recently, kind of getting back to my roots in ornithology, which is how I started as an ecologist, I just received a grant from the American Ornithological Society to do some additional research investigating how potentially things like dams and other large-scale water management infrastructure may have been one of the driving factors in the major declines of a number of bird species in the last 50 years or so. There was a lot of press starting, I think, last year, the year before, about how we've lost something like 3 billion birds in North America since the 1970s. One major contributor to this that hasn't been explored might be trophic effects of water management. So anyway, that's a story for another time. To get into tonight's talk, I'll be speaking about some research I did while I was hosted on a Fulbright postdoctoral fellowship at Doñana Biological Station in Seville, Spain, in Andalusia, in the southern part of the country. And it's a really interesting institution. It's one of the more prominent ecological research institutions in the country. And its genesis, I think, is particularly interesting. It was actually born of one of the first actions ever taken by the World Wildlife Fund. When they were first founded, their first major act was to protect Doñana National Park, which I'll be talking about, and help establish the Doñana Biological Station, which studies it. And nowadays it's run by CSIC, which is the, I guess I would translate that as like the Higher Council of Scientific Research in Spain. And that's kind of a combination of our USGS and National Science Foundation. So I was based at this group specifically with the Wetland Ecology Department. I'm going to translate everything in my head now. And I was based in Andy Green's research labs. This was a professor from Oxford who moved down to Spain, probably for much better weather. And he has this really great and vibrant international lab doing research on primarily water bird ecology and the conservation of water birds in Mediterranean environments. And so we had students from Sweden and Argentina and all over Spain and Germany and the Netherlands as well. So it was a great place to work. And interestingly, the only two Americans in this entire institution of more than 300 people were both in this lab. So that was also kind of fun for me. So I wanted to start very broadly, obviously at the global scale, talking about why the Iberian Peninsula and Spain in particular are really ecologically and culturally interesting areas. And specifically, if we look at the juxtaposition of this peninsula on the planet with regards to the rest of the continents, we can see that it's kind of a bridge between the rest of continental Europe and Africa. It's really a close contact point there. And you can see this when you're in Andalusia, this southernmost part of Spain that's right up against Africa. You can see this culturally, you can see it in the art there, certainly in the food, in the language actually, which is really interesting. So there are lots of words in Spain that there are two different words for the same thing, and one of them comes from Latin and one of them comes from Arabic. So a good example I always think of is the word for scorpion. The Latin root is escorpio, which that seems pretty intuitive for us, but the other word that people use more often there is alacran, which I think is literally just completely borrowed from Arabic. And then, as a naturalist, I noticed that horticulturally, there's a lot of African influence there. There are date palms all over the place and lots of other African and Middle Eastern climate plants that have been introduced all over Seville and the rest of Andalusia, and they do great there. But looking beyond the human side, the birds are also a really major sort of clash and intermixing of these two very different continental biological assemblages. And so in the same area, in the same day or the same hour, you could be seeing a number of bird groups that are very strongly associated with the African continent, things like Egyptian vultures and hoopoes, Elanius kites, and the marbled teal, which is endangered, I think, in the Mediterranean now. And turn around and see common backyard birds you'd expect in Holland or the UK, things like tawny owls, European robins, and blue tits. So really, it's a place where you can kind of get it all in that sense, which is really exciting. And if you're there for an entire annual cycle, like I was, the phenology makes a big difference as well. The Iberian Peninsula is kind of a key bridge in a number of really major flyways. And so huge proportions of the entire populations, the entire breeding populations of some migratory birds will actually pass through Spain before spreading out to the rest of Northwest Asia and Europe and things like that. So really a fantastic place to be. And if you're going to do birding in Europe, this is the part I would really recommend to visit. And my research specifically was in kind of the birdiest place in the birdiest country, which was this Doñana National Park, which was established in the mid-60s and has been kind of growing ever since. It's this beautiful, dynamic, temporary wetland landscape with an incredible history. People have been finding signs of human development and society there from as far back as the Phoenicians. There are all sorts of Roman camps turning up all the time as the dunes move back and forth. So it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a biosphere reserve. It's the largest protected area in Europe. Just a fantastic, magical, and kind of otherworldly place. And so here's a map of kind of the layout of the park, and you can see that it's down in this lower southwest corner of Spain along the coast. It's bordered by a gigantic river called the Guadalquivir, which has been channelized so that you can go all the way up to Seville from there. And it's dominated by a whole, this kind of Mediterranean hydrological rhythm of going dry and wet and dry and wet. And of course, it's being affected by climate change and things, but it's a tremendous biodiversity hotspot with huge global importance, again, as a place to stop along all these migratory flyways. So the landscape of Doñana itself is also really interesting. Beyond just the protected area of the park, there's this larger sort of natural heritage zone around it that has lower levels of protection. So it's still kind of managed, but it has some degree of ecological importance. So on the left in blue is the actual strictly protected area known as the national park. And on the right, there is this larger protected national heritage site, which is primarily rice agriculture. And there's a lot of hydrological and biological relationships between the two that are really worth exploring. And one of the biggest differences I think that's fascinating and becoming very interesting to scientists is that if you look at the protected area on the natural side, you see a very predictable rhythm that they dry out in the summer and the wetlands are wet during the winter and the spring, which is, again, just sort of the normal rhythm of a Mediterranean climate. But on the other side, the artificial side, because they're constantly irrigating from the river, it's wet whenever they want it to be. There aren't some years that are drier than others or whatever. They're just always providing water. And so there's this constant wetland habitat. There's a lot less variation. Now, what people are starting to notice is perhaps a bit concerning and certainly something we're questioning is that as climate change is continuing, and we know that climate change affects Mediterranean climates disproportionately, the amount of time that the wetlands in the natural landscape are wet is shrinking. So that it's a reduction in the hydro period, they would call it technically. And that means that kind of puts the squeeze on the birds that need to breed in these wetlands because the amount of time they have water is getting less and less and less. And eventually that's not enough time for them to make a nest, lay eggs, incubate, hatch the eggs, raise the babies. Eventually they're just squeezed out. And so what we're seeing is that a lot of these bird species are starting to move over now. And they're starting to rely more on these artificial wetlands. But those are very different habitats with a lot of different things going on. So there's kind of this big question of, well, what's the story here? How are individual birds acting on a much finer scale? How are they interacting with this rice field landscape? And how are dynamics within the rice fields affecting water birds? And that brings me to the study species for this research. I should note, I got an email this morning. The research I'm presenting to you right now has just been published as of this morning in the Journal of the British Ornithological Union. So you guys are the first ones getting its published content now. So I can feel good about that. So my focal organism here was the lesser black-backed gull. So this is a part of that much larger white-headed gull complex of all these weird, extremely adaptable gulls that are all over the world and interbreeding with each other, and the species lines are kind of blurred. But what we're seeing is this is a bird that its populations are skyrocketing all over Europe. Some of its breeding sites are just disappearing and they're just locally extirpated. In other places, there's new breeding colonies emerging that are absolutely enormous. They're invading the cities and they're showing up in these rice fields in greater and greater numbers every year. And so they're really of major interest. And because they're of such interest for the rest of Europe, I mean, people in the UK and the Netherlands and Belgium are really concerned about what's going on with these birds. They are the subject of this really massive and incredibly sharp research consortium across a number of universities throughout Europe called the UVA system. And they're actually placing these data loggers on individual lesser black-backed gulls on their breeding colonies up in Northern Europe, and then tracking them throughout their annual cycle. And they have all these download towers up and down Europe, basically along the flyway, that can download the information from these gulls. So we know we had info on them, and we knew they were of interest to the rice fields. So we thought, this is great. We can start investigating their behavior a bit. And one of the reasons we think they are increasing so much in the rice fields is it's a fantastic place to spend the winter. So they come down to Spain essentially just to hang out and go on vacation, right? Which is honestly something a lot of other people from Northern Europe are doing in the wintertime. And they just basically need a place to sleep that's safe and a lot of food to eat. And that food appears to be coming from an invasive crayfish that was introduced actually from the US. It's called the Louisiana red swamp crayfish, Procamberus clarkii. It's a horrible invasive, driving a lot of other species out. And it exists in just absolutely absurd densities inside these rice fields. So these birds can actually just go for them and feed on them for their entire winter stay, get really fat, and then fly back up in the spring to breed in, in northern England or wherever they're going. So I'm not sure if this Zoom is optimized for that, but I can try to play a video here and we can see, maybe you can see it, maybe you can't. But this was a video I took while doing some of my field work. And you can actually see that as the rice field is being tilled, all these crayfish are being exposed and other invertebrate prey, and these massive swarms of gulls will form. It was primarily lesser blackback gulls, but also a couple other species, including one that I can't remember the English name for it. But they just essentially follow these tractors all day and just feast on all these crayfish, and they'll steal from each other and they'll fight. But they, you can see in an individual field at times, I think the biggest I counted was 15,000 in a rice field. So they really go overboard and they're becoming a major ecological force. So the study that I did was focused on these adjacent rice fields, which are highlighted here in a false infrared image from a satellite, which is, again, is right up against the national park. And these birds kind of are moving back and forth between the two, which is important to keep in mind. So when we think about the rice itself and what's going on in that habitat that all these birds are using, there's a very predictable annual rhythm to how it's cultivated. Again, because these farmers are taking water from the river, they get the water whenever they want and however long they want it. So in the late summer and fall, when I arrived in Spain, they were at the pre-harvest phase. I apologize for all the Spanish on these slides. I've presented these at a few international conferences, and so I had to have bilingual resources, but the English is always on top, so you keep that in mind. But this pre-harvest phase is basically just a lot of big rice plants that are ready to go, and they're heavy with seed, and they're green. There's not a lot of habitat value to it, really. It's a nice place to sit, but the birds can't access those crayfish. Then there's the active harvest phase, which you just saw a video of, and when this tilling is happening, all of that vegetation has been cleared, the harvest has already happened, and the sediment is being turned over to expose all this rich invertebrate prey. And then once all that is done, farmers will flood the entire field and leave it inundated somewhere between maybe 6 inches to a couple of feet, just as a big standing pond for several months. And then usually with evaporation throughout the summer, it'll start to draw out again. And so what you see is this constant and predictable pattern. So we were really interested in what effects this would have on the gull's behavior. If we have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these birds showing up, what are their fine scale behavior patterns within the rice fields, and how are those being affected by what's going on? So we started by, again, collecting a lot of these data logger information. So we chose, I think, 7 focal birds, downloaded all of their data for a certain overwintering year in Spain, and then kept track of their locations over time. What's really cool about these data loggers is that they're extremely fancy. They also have accelerometers, like our cell phones, that show, or like a Wiimote controller, right? It can just detect how the bird's moving, not just where it is in space, but is it tilted forward, is it tilted back, is it shaking around? So we could also get information on their behavior from these trackers. And essentially we just had this massive database of millions and millions of data points, and had to go in and start parsing those apart and getting an idea and kind of unraveling a story from those. And one of the ways we could do that was by seeing where the birds were, not just XY coordinates, but what was going on in any individual field where they were hanging out. We actually gathered a lot of Landsat remote sensing imagery and used machine learning techniques to classify those images and determine what was going on in each pond. So on the left here, you have what the satellite was seeing when it looked over the rice fields of Doñana. And on the right, we see what a computer algorithm that I trained was determining each individual field to be. So each one of those colors means some class, like, oh, this one just got harvested. This one's flooded right now. This one's unharvested. So we would know what the condition was in any paddy in which the birds seemed to be hanging out a lot, and what behaviors they were doing there, and so on. So then, of course, there was a lot of very fancy and painstaking behavioral or statistical analysis involved with, writing codes and boring quantitative things that we don't need to go into, but, a lot of geospatial overlays and things like that, and examining these accelerometer patterns and behaviors and associations between them. And the more fun part was actually getting to go out in the field and drive around in a Doñana biological station Jeep and get yelled at by farmers and things, and get out of these rice fields and take observations of what the birds were doing, how many there were they leaving the field, staying with them, and a lot of time spying on gulls. lot of adventures within there that I can get into, but beyond that, we also did historical research. So Doñana Biological Station, there's been incredible research going on there for decades. So we were also able to draw data from historical surveys where people were counting skulls at different times of year and then applying those to our work here to see if they fit the same hypotheses and same questions we were after. And so again, yeah, this was just kind of a neat way to see the landscape in Spain. It was a way of hearing new accents that I'd never encountered as a Spanish speaker, just being way out in the boonies and talking to some real country folk. It was a pretty cool experience. So that was a great place to be. So looking at some of the results that came out of this, one thing we saw was that we did see variations in how much the birds, the gulls, were relying on different types of rice paddies, depending on their condition. So these top bar graphs show the distribution of available types of habitat cover within the paddies. So at the beginning, there was mostly green vegetation because there hadn't been any harvest yet. When the active harvest started, you got this huge dynamic mixture of different paddy types. You had some of them that were already flooded. You had a lot of them that were still green, some of them that were already harvested. And that mixture seemed to vary because of the harvesting equipment available, there were probably only 1 or 2 machines among a couple hundred farmers. So they actually they would pass these machines between each other. So the harvesting happened in a very discordant fashion. And so that made this kind of mosaic landscape. And then looking further into the post-harvest phase, we had pretty much just lots of flooded fields. And then over time, those were drawing down. And what we noticed over time was that the birds would make huge use of flooded fields above all. Which was really interesting. And they also seem to prefer these right after harvest and right after tilling sort of fields, but not so much the green vegetation and the dry land and things like that. They were really using these, it seemed like, for 2 separate purposes, and we needed some further analyses to kind of get into that. So when we looked at the behavioral analyses, and this was both me literally sitting in a car and watching these birds for 9 hours a day for several weeks, but also using computer learning mechanisms to classify the sort of Wiimote accelerometer data we got, we found very consistently across both methods of observation that the birds that were spending all their time in these post-harvest tilling environments were spending all their time usually flying around, fighting each other, stealing, or eating food. So that was the cafeteria of their sort of winter country club. And then the ones in the flooded fields were just using them for taking a bath or sleeping or just hanging out, or what ornithologists call loafing. And so it was very clearly this kind of, when there were both of these habitats available within the rice fields, you kind of got this winter spa retreat kind of environment where you could go over to a cafeteria field that had just been harvested. You could go fill yourself with crawdads and then come back to a filled pond and have a nap. And that's pretty much all they were doing. So that was pretty interesting. And we could actually see that when the fields were doing that, when the fields had all of these different characteristics available at the same time, we saw the highest level of birds hanging out in the fields. And on either ends, on kind of the shoulder seasons, we saw a lot of birds hanging out in the river, which meant they were kind of staging and waiting for that phase to happen so they could get in. So these are old historical counts from previous years by some researchers. The blue line was from a survey on a boat. So this was along the river, and they saw a huge peak in gull numbers right before the harvest started. And then it dropped when the harvest began, and that corresponds with this black line, which was done by an airplane survey over the actual rice fields. And so as the number on the river dropped, they had a huge bump in the number that were inside the fields because they were, of course, taking advantage of that summer retreat. And then when that good habitat ran out, they saw a sudden decrease in the number of birds inside the fields and another peak on the river as they were sort of moving on to other things. So that was pretty cool to see the correspondence between what I was observing, what the GPS transmitters were observing, and what past studies were seeing. So looking back at the transmitters again, we actually saw a very similar pattern where, in this case, the orange line on the bottom is essentially how much distance the birds were covering every day. So it would be like if you had a fitness app on your phone, how many steps you were taking. This is like how much ground they're covering back and forth every day. And we saw that was much higher before harvest. It reached a total minimum, again, at that winter retreat stage when the birds just didn't have to go anywhere. They could just go next door for a meal, go back and take a nap. They didn't have to go anywhere, they wouldn't, and they were just hanging out. And then as it got closer and closer to migration and they didn't have those resources anymore, their daily movement starts to go up very sharply. And that is the exact opposite trend of this blue line, which is the amount of time of their daily time budget that they were spending inside the rice fields. When they weren't going anywhere and they were being lazy, they were spending 100% of their time a lot of the time in these rice fields. And then that time really dropped off post-harvest when, again, they didn't have that variety. So that was a really interesting pattern to be observing. And you can see these three kind of phases, right, within this diagram where pre-harvest, they're not spending much time at all on the landscape. There's this sudden increase in percent of time inside the rice field complex, and then very little movement, lots of time inside, and then the two lines switch again as they start to head off on migration and get much more active. When we took an even more detailed look at this, we wanted to examine, okay, yes, we know how much percent of their time they're spending in the rice fields, but what time of day is that? And this was probably one of our most interesting findings and certainly one of the most important ones from a human perspective. So in this graph here, the more yellow a block is, or the more orange a block is, that's less time being spent in the rice fields. And the more purple it is more time being spent in the rice fields. And these two lines, one is sunrise and the orange one is sunset. So basically this y-axis is the hour of the day. So everything between those two lines is the daytime. And what we could see was this strange pattern, right? Where in the pre-harvest phase, the birds were only inside the rice fields during the day, which was eating time. During the actual harvest, they were sleeping there and they were eating there. All of their time, the whole thing is purple. And then suddenly in post-harvest, we started to see this weird pattern. We saw the opposite of what we saw in the fall, where the birds were starting to sleep in the rice fields, but eat somewhere else. They were leaving every day to go eat somewhere, but then always coming back to sleep in the flooded fields. And of course that makes sense because at the end, there were only flooded fields available. And when we actually started to look into this, we realized that in this phase, they were all going to garbage dumps. Every single one of them was going off to some garbage dump, sometimes like 50, 60, 70 kilometers away to go eat a bunch of trash and then come back and sleep in rice fields where we grow our food. And that's a pretty major concern there, right? There's been very clear evidence that birds like this can transmit antibiotic resistant bacteria. They can transmit heavy metals, a lot of compounds and chemicals that we don't want anywhere near our food. And yet every year this is happening. There are a couple 100,000 gulls eating trash, returning to the rice fields, sleeping, pooping everywhere, and then going back and doing it the next day. So this is our major kind of societal outcome of this research. And indeed, if you look at the track of an individual gull and sort of the density of where they're spending their time over the course of the season, you can really clearly see this. So this is one bird that we were examining. This orange line here is where all the rice fields are. And in the pre-harvest phase, we see that this bird was spending, the majority of its time inside the rice fields and occasionally straying down to the national park. Nothing tremendously surprising there. When we got to that winter resort phase, when they could get everything they needed in the rice fields, suddenly this bird wasn't leaving at all. It moved maybe to different fields. Those kind of red dots there are very high space use, but it had suddenly constricted its space use. It didn't need to go anywhere, so it just hung out there. But then as soon as we got to the post-harvest phase, we had this really consistent, literal commuting going on, where every single day the bird would wake up in the rice fields, go off to this dump way up here in a whole other county, basically, and then come back at night after it was done eating trash, have a nice sleep and have a poop, and then repeat the cycle the next day. Again, a really fascinating behavior, incredibly intelligent animals, but concerning for us, I would think. So that's the research part of this talk. I have obviously a lot of collaborators from various institutions to thank for all their help with this. I got a tremendous amount of support getting to work on this project. It was really delightful. So I have, depending on how much time we have, I have more slides that are a lot less formal and more about just bird watching in Spain and where you can go and what kind of cool birds I ended up seeing. So I'd be happy to get into those if we have time. But if we'd like to do some questions about the research first, I'm happy to do that. And I kind of leave that to my hosts here, whatever we would like to do.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, Charles? I'd like to see the rest of your slides, and then we can come back and do some questions.
Sounds good. Okay, I'll keep an eye on the time, but I can at least go through a few of them. So this is totally non-academic and just me nerding out about awesome stuff I got to see. But Spain has an absolutely ridiculous biodiversity of birds. There's incredible stuff to see. There's all sorts of great support for it. And this was a picture of a wonderful sign I found when I was in one of the national parks. Even just in Seville, in this urban area I was living in, this is a city about the size of Boston, and definitely as urbanized. There were three major places where I saw a lot of really cool birds there. And those were La Giralda, which is this like very touristy, ancient cathedral. I think it's the biggest Gothic cathedral in the world. This is a picture of the front of it. Alamillo Park, which is a modernized park nearby. And then La Plaza de España, which is this really beautiful, also kind of tourist destination in the city. So starting with La Giralda, this is a picture of it on the outside. It is very well known in Europe for hosting a very old colony of these really cool endangered colonial falcons. They're called the lesser kestrel. And these are them on the left. I did not take that picture. For all the pictures we see, if it's a really crappy picture, I took it. If it's a really good one, I did not take it. That's how you'll know. But these falcons are interestingly colonial, and they're migratory, and they hang out. They actually have lived at the top of this cathedral for hundreds of years. I mean, there's accounts of some of the original monks working there who would keep track of these falcons. So really, really cool, and you just see them in the middle of the city. And I was walking around in this like tourist Mecca, staring up with my binoculars and just getting all sorts of weird looks from people, but very well worth it. And even cooler than that, I got the opportunity of actually banding some of them and putting transmitters on them. So this was actually some research I helped out with in a nearby, more rural area where they were capturing these birds on the nest and putting transmitters on them and tracking them, again, for conservation purposes. And I really like this picture on the right. I don't know if you can see the tail feathers sticking out, but if you were ever wondering how you measure an angry falcon and get how much it weighs, you put it inside of a Pringles tube so it can't hurt you, and then you weigh it. And that was enlightening for me. And then there's also the much larger common kestrel over there. And I should say, both of these kestrels are way bigger than our American kestrel. This completely threw me for a loop as an American birder. Like, the lesser kestrel is considerably larger than ours, and the common kestrel is bigger than the merlin. So it's really confusing. But this is a crappy picture that I took of a common kestrel who lived outside of my apartment. And every day he would grab a house sparrow and just tear it to pieces. And you can actually see a feather falling in that picture. So that was him throwing a house sparrow, which was great. So next was the Plaza de España. So this is my obligatory tourist picture there. Again, like, you wouldn't think it was a birding spot, but there was some amazing stuff there. And my favorite thing here and in most of Seville were the swifts. So the middle and the right here are both North American swifts, and this is kind of what I'm used to. So chimney swifts out east, and then these Voxus swifts here. But in this part of Spain, they have pallid swifts, which are in a whole different genus. And you can't really tell from the picture, but they are way, way bigger and way louder. And there are just thousands. They nest on all the big buildings. They nested all over the Plaza de España. And when they come back on migration, they're screaming. I mean, they're really prominent, and they'll go right over your head. It's just worlds away from the swifts that I'm used to, that are quiet and far away, and you don't see that many. They're really in your face over there, and it's really cool to see. And the other thing all over the Plaza de España is they have this invasive rose-winged parakeet from India, and they're just everywhere. Again, super loud, but beautiful birds. So they're cool to see. And I actually had a friend come visit me from India, and he was saying it was like kind of freaking him out because it sounded like home, in Spain, to hear this bird from where he was from. And then another great one in the city is the house martin, which also is in a totally different genus. I think it's Delicon or Delichon. They look so much like tree swallows to me, maybe a little larger, but I was really impressed to see that they're much more distantly related, and they make these beautiful mud nests, just again all over the place. And then the other one with prominent mud nests is the red-rumped swallow. I think the reason I really enjoy these is that they have an absolutely huge distribution. So I did some research in Vietnam a few years ago. I saw this exact same species there. I mean, they're like kind of like the barn swallow. They're just everywhere, and they make these massive nests. I think the swifts will actually reuse these nests sometimes too, the ones from the last year. So they play a pretty important role that way. And then finally, there's this Alamillo Park, which is a really interesting, again, just an urban park, a lot like kind of Central Park, maybe a little more manicured than that. It was mostly just orange trees and lawn. And yet I saw this tremendous diversity of kind of European garden birds. So blue tits, Eurasian sarin, great tit, great spotted woodpecker, chaffinch, Eurasian goldfinch, which is like one of my favorite birds over there, the song thrush, and then a neat one for Spain is the Thekla lark. So just, there was a lot of neat stuff going on there, and I could just kind of wander through and see it all. And one of my favorites, so here's a crappy picture on the left, which you can tell that I took, and a much better one by a much more talented photographer. The Eurasian hoopoe is a reason of its own to go to Spain. I mean, just the most bizarre, strange bird in its own family with the coolest Latin name in the world. Its scientific name is Upupa epops, which I can't get over. And they're everywhere. They show up again on migration all of a sudden, and there's just these huge, bizarre orange birds all over the place. And outside my office, actually, this was, again, crappy pictures, so I took them. Right outside my office in the industrial park where the research station was, we had spotted flycatchers nesting, and I would have them over me the whole time I was eating lunch and looking for bugs and stuff. It was really great. And within Alamillo Park, which again is adjacent to that whole area, there was also a beautiful observatory for birds. This was one of my friends from Britain who I did a lot of translating for, and he was an excellent birder. And he, of course, you know, he was on his continent, so he knew all this stuff. He was helping me identify some really great birds. And at this particular spot, we saw two really awesome, you know, hard to find ones. One of them was the pendulum tit, which is this gorgeous little thing. And they actually make hanging nests on the reeds in wetlands. And we got a little bittern, which is, of course, pretty much the ecological equivalent of our least bittern. Also just a beautiful skulky bird. So I couldn't not talk about Doñana, and I'm going to mention a lot of species here, but this is not even scratching the surface. I mean, the species counts for a couple of days in Doñana can be in the hundreds. It's really astonishing. And I went there as much as I could, but really it's an incredible place that you have to spend weeks at to get everything. But my first major sighting that I got, and we were talking about, I heard Denny talking about the way that the bitterns act. This was a Eurasian bittern. It was my first really cool bird that I got out there. It was a juvenile, I think, and it just stood there and stared at us like that for 10, 15 minutes while we took photographs, which was just a huge treat for me. And this, again, you have this whole landscape with beautiful boardwalks and places to go. It's just an incredible experience with a lot of different kind of visitor centers and nooks and crannies and places to go. And the wetlands, again, when they're flooded, are just filled with bird life. So this was a picture I took of a huge flock of black-winged stilts. So they're same genus as our black-necked stilt. And I mean, they sound the same, they act the same. You know, the only thing is they have an all-white head, but just a gorgeous animal, and they were all over the place. And the major attractant that brings most people, especially non-birders, are the flamingos. And so these I think the greater flamingos are just all over the place, and they fill up the saline ponds there, and you'll have them flying over and nesting, and it's incredible, the numbers. And one of my favorite pictures that I took there, this is just in for comedic value, but there was this very old, very friendly dog who was just super nice, and he always had this "beware of dog" sign in front of him every time we drove through, and I just thought that was hysterical. The last place that's really worth visiting around Doñana is this really old village called El Rocio, and there's sort of a patron saint in the cathedral there, who is the patron saint of wetlands, or the patron saint of marshes, depending on how you translate it. So this is my favorite saint. And this actual village has this gigantic wetland next to it that is used for horse grazing when it's dry, and it attracts just ludicrous biodiversity. And I saw quite a few really amazing things there. Once you're out in the countryside, European bee eaters are all over the place. And that's one of those birds like the painted bunting where it just looks like some little kid colored them in. They're just incredible. Collared pratt and coal is just an incredible group. That's I think a family that doesn't even occur in North America. The marbled teal is a major attraction for the birding crowd because they're endangered and super, super rare. And I actually went to a visitor center and identified one of these and pointed out to someone. And it was this whole group of Swedish guys who were drinking beers, and I guess they were finishing some huge birding trip. And when they saw that I had found a marbled teal, 2 of them started crying and the rest started like high-fiving and cheersing and like chugging their beers. And I guess they had been trying to find one the whole time. So I did them a major favor and they bought me a beer and it was great. But one of those birds that, you know, if you're like me and you don't know, you couldn't tell it's a huge deal. And of course, the Spanish imperial eagle is a major one that is all over the place. Dartford warbler was one of the ones that just blew my mind. Eurasian spoonbills are all over the place. The Zitting cisticola is another really bizarre bird, taxonomically totally broken off from other related species, and booted eagles from Africa are major too. So I think we're probably getting close to wrapping up anyway, but I had a great time there. I got to volunteer bird watching and banding with people. I worked with ASAIL, the Spanish Ornithological Society, and just a fantastic time. As soon as international travel becomes remotely feasible again, I would recommend people check out Spain, absolutely. And with whatever time we have, I'm happy to take questions. Otherwise, thanks very much for listening.
Yeah, a great presentation, Charles. Really enjoyed that. The thing that intrigues me is the closeness to Africa that Spain is, and you could kind of tell the mixing of the groups of birds there. It's pretty nice.
It's really amazing, and depending on I guess the time of year, you get these tides of birds washing back and forth between them. And so certain times of year, especially in the summertime, there was all sorts of stuff coming up that I knew had to be from, you know, Africa.
Are there any plans to kind of, like from research, like how all the gulls are going to dumps and back to the fields, are there any plans to kind of eliminate some of that contact, the gulls going back to the field, because it's obviously a health risk? So,
and I should say this is happening. This happens in North America too with ring-billed gulls. It's just people haven't studied it as much, but it's happening. I don't know what the solutions are really. I mean, these gulls are absolutely ubiquitous. To build a roof over everything, which maybe they're going to have to do. You know, I think that's one thing that helps a lot in the US is that we have a lot of underground landfills, but that is not, at least in Spain, the prevailing technology in a lot of Southern Europe. So unless they start doing that, they're going to have to, you know, maybe get some way of hazing them, you know, having something that makes a lot of noise or something to get rid of them. But when I was there, we didn't hear from anyone that the government was thinking about it.
okay.
Actually, I had a question about the gull study.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any evidence that the gulls are having any kind of influence on the crayfish population?
Yeah, I don't know. I imagine not. I mean, their capacity for reproduction, the crayfish, just completely outrageous because it's not only the gulls that are working on them. Glossy ibis used to be super rare in that part of Spain, and nowadays their populations, they've increased, I think, 100-fold. And they are also only there for the crayfish, pretty much. So there are a lot of animals really working on them, and the numbers don't seem to decrease, but I don't know anyone who's actually quantitatively gone in and surveyed the crayfish. It's just that I think it's more of a qualitative thing. If every time someone does any field work, the whole place is crawling with them, you know?
Yeah.
It's a giant smorgasbord for them.
Yeah.
How much have gull populations increased or decreased? How has there been any shifts in recent decades?
Yeah, that's a super good question, and there have. I don't think, because this is such a widespread animal that is found, it breeds in so many different countries and then migrates so much. I don't think there's enough evidence to show that their overall populations are going up. In certain areas, they definitely are. What we've seen is that their breeding colonies, they're formerly natural breeding colonies, usually along the coasts of the British Isles. All of those are starting to disappear, and the birds are starting to breed in cities and then eat in fields. So they're becoming an urban adapter. very quickly. And that's the main shift we see, is that all of their natural populations are disappearing, which again probably has some major impact on systems as well.
All right, any other questions for Charles? Well, that was fantastic, Charles. Thank you
Great.
so much. Really enjoyable.
Yeah, thanks so much.